Well, thank you very much. Someone must have read, we're adding positions at third sector, and someone must have read the job description. It said, must be PowerPoint prolific and have high intellect. That's pretty funny. Caroline's going to get a lot of good grief about that. So I have the great honor to introduce a couple co-panelists up here, and I'm going to ask them each to say some words, but then just open it up for conversation so that we can really start to dig in. And if the conversation isn't getting juicy enough, I've got a lot of experience in front of audiences talking about this topic, and I know what the toughest questions are, so I will raise them and see how we do wrestling them. Now, maybe someone can come up with even tougher questions, which would be great. But just to start with Ian Galloway, to the left. Ian is a senior research associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And the way we got to know each other is that Ian did an absolutely terrific job at putting together what I now consider to be, if you were to download one document, I would download this book that Ian put together, which is a collection of articles that explores the present and the future of pay for success and social impact bonds, and also brings maybe I'll say a light scholarly point of view to it, not a impenetrable one. But please, thank you, Ian, for being here, and we'll ask you to share a little bit of what you learned through that process. And then Greg Avis, who I've met recently, we seem to keep running into each other incredibly. I think many of you already know Greg out here, but he is a founder of Summit Partners, which is a very esteemed growth equity firm with, I guess, $10 billion of capital under management. But somehow, miraculously, Greg finds time to chair many boards and sit on other boards. For example, he chairs the board at Williams College, which I would think would be almost a full-time job.
Just getting there is a full-time.
He is a former chair of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. He chairs the Irvine Foundation. And then most recently, we've intersected because he also sits on the board of New Profit, Inc. And New Profit on the East Coast is an organization that is in its 15th year now, focused on social entrepreneurship. And we got to know each other because Greg was very helpful in helping New Profit assess the opportunity to invest in the Roca project that Kimberly described for us. And so we're just delighted to have you here, both of you. Why don't we start, if you wouldn't mind, Ian, if you could explain a little bit what you saw after surveying this landscape and putting together that excellent publication.
Sure, and thank you for that introduction. And for those of you who are interested in downloading that, and I appreciate the plug too for the journal. For those of you who are interested in downloading that journal, if you Google Pay for Success and Federal Reserve, it should be the first result that pops up. So, and if you'd like a hard copy, I'm happy to send you one. We have like 1,000 in the basement. So a lot of you may be wondering why somebody from the Federal Reserve is here to talk about Pay for Success. That's a completely natural question. I work in the Community Development Department. Every Federal Reserve around the country, there are 12, and also a Federal Reserve department, Community Development Department at the Board of Governors, so 13 in total. Our sort of mission is to, let me back up. We exist because of the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA. A lot of you may be familiar with that. It basically requires banks to invest and lend and serve low-income communities. And after the act was passed in 1977, they created our department at all of the Federal Reserve banks, as well as the other regulators, to support banks in making investments in low-income communities, because it's not something that they were particularly comfortable with at the time. They have developed a great deal of capacity since then, and so our function actually has evolved from being sort of a supportive arm of the Fed for the banks to really more of kind of, to borrow a term from Alan Berube at Brookings, we're sort of a think and do tank. So about half of our department is out in the community, meeting with community members, advocacy groups, foundations, local government. It's sort of ear to the ground, trying to get a sense of sort of where the trends are going, and then kind of feeding that information back up to us in the research side of the house, which is sort of the think tank part. So I work in that that research part of the department. And we research a variety of issues, and most recently, pay for success. And I think that, personally, as the editor of that journal, my primary interest in pursuing this topic was a recognition that the community development finance industry, as successful as it has been over the last 50 years, is not getting the job done on poverty. The poverty rate today is roughly what it was when the war on poverty started. That's an oversimplification, obviously. There are a number of other factors at play. Income transfers are not factored into that, for example. But I don't think we should be patting ourselves on the back necessarily for having moved the dial significantly on poverty. So I think that sort of was an indication to us that our theory of change as an industry may not be quite right. And I think our theory of change for the last 40 years has been, if we rebuild the physical environment, if we build stable, healthy, safe housing for people, community facilities, walkable streets, things of that nature, then the people living in those neighborhoods will do better and will sort of move out of poverty and on a more sustainable path. And I think that theory of change was partially correct. It's necessary to rebuild, in a lot of cases, these communities, but it's insufficient. We need to develop new tools to build human capital in these communities. It's not enough to build tools that support real estate development alone. They need to be coupled with human capital development tools and investment products and structures. And so I think Pay for Success is that future. It's that investment tool, sort of akin to, as Kimberly mentioned, the low-income housing tax credit has been such a great success for building affordable housing. We need a LIHTC for human capital. And Pay for Success, I think, is that LIHTC, whether it's a social impact bond or another structure. So that's sort of how I got into this. And I know we're really pressed on time, so I'm going to try to get through sort of a few things really quickly, sort of key takeaways from the journal. I have sort of 5 benefits, as I see them, of Pay for Success, and then sort of 5 potential pitfalls that worry me a little bit. So I'm just going to get through those really quickly, and then if there are questions after our presentation, I'd be happy to answer them. So first of all, I think one of the primary benefits of Pay for Success is that it supports innovation and rapid prototyping. This is something that Kimberly mentioned in her presentation. The community development industry, as I mentioned, has had a great deal of success, but unfortunately, over the course of the last 40 years, where it has professionalized, it has become relatively calcified on the innovation front. So we haven't seen a lot of innovation, a lot of new ideas within community development for quite a long time. Pay for Success enables innovation, and the example that I like to use, and I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on innovation, and I'm going to get really quick through the other 9.
George's getting nervous.
I know. I thought we had more time for this panel, but we don't. My favorite Pay for Success example that's out there is the X Prize. Has anybody heard of this? So this was a prize in the late 90s, early 2000s. The X Prize Foundation basically announced that they would be willing to pay $10 million to the first private company that could build a spaceship that could fly 100 kilometers above the Earth with 2 people in it, bring them back safely, twice in 2 weeks. They didn't care what it looked like. They didn't care how fast it was, anything else. Just those were the criteria for winning the prize. Eventually, a team did win. It was backed by Paul Allen in Seattle. But that's not particularly interesting. What's interesting is that to win that $10 million prize, 27 teams from 7 countries around the world collectively raised $100 million in private financing to develop new space travel technology. So not only did the X Prize Foundation get a working spaceship for their $10 million, which is a great deal, they got $100 million of new innovation, which is now the basis of a $1.2 billion space tourism industry. And all they had to do was put money at the end of the rainbow and let 27 companies figure out how to do it. Why can't we do the same thing to solve our most intractable social problems? So I think innovation is really important. The second is this has the potential to bust funding silos. This is, again, something that Kimberly talked about. If you build an affordable housing unit that houses chronically homeless people, those people don't go to the emergency room as often. There ought to be some way to capture the savings that accrue to the county hospital or to the insurance companies or to Medicaid and use those savings to build more housing. Number 3, it promotes evidence-based policy. There's a big push for this at the federal level. I think I saw a statistic recently that only 3% of federal programs are actually evaluated, which is shocking but also not shocking. So we need to move towards a more evidence-based paradigm. Pay for Success has the ability to do that because it is so essential to these contracts. If you can't prove that you're actually doing the thing that you said you were going to do, then the government doesn't pay. It builds on the success of the existing public-private investment model that's been pioneered by the community development industry. The low-income housing tax credit, again, is a great example of that. So I think the community development industry is primed to take advantage of these new tools. And then finally, the 5th primary benefit that came out of the journal was that these kinds of contracts can be used to support neighborhood-level kind of community quarterbacks that do holistic community development. So for those of you who are familiar with the Harlem Children's Zone in New York, why can't Jeff Canada sign a contract with the city of New York that basically says every year that they can keep crime in the zone below the city average, the city will pay them $5 million. Every year they can keep education scores above the city average, the city will pay them $5 million. And then leave it up to Jeff Canada to go out and raise the private financing to run Harlem Children's Zone for that year. These contracts could completely transform the way that we do holistic community development. Pivoting really quickly to...
So Ian, here's what I'm going to suggest, because we are going to come back to the obstacles and risks.
Okay.
Could we double back on that?
Yes.
And then, because I have a feeling that Greg may also have some obstacles and risks to share as well.
Great. Thanks, George, and thanks, Fred, my ALF classmate, for inviting me here today. Using Kimberly just walked out, but using her Moneyball analogy, I see a lot of people saw the movie. I mean, I feel a little bit like those scouts in the room, the old scouts in the room, equipped with a stopwatch and their notepad. And when I came first, sitting between Billy Bean and Paul Podesta here, so I feel a little bit like that because I just came to Pay for Success this past summer through a convergence of events with New Profit and the James Irvine Foundation. So I apologize for my recent entry, but have some. I wear a couple hats here. One is as a board member of some organizations that are very interested in this area. One, obviously, New Profit. We just committed $2 million to the Roca project. It was our first endeavor in Pay for Success. And New Profit, as George explained, is really a venture fund for social entrepreneurs. We've invested over $150 million over the last 10 years. And this is our first commitment. And we looked at the Roca project much like a venture capitalist would look at any deal. Great entrepreneur, evidence-based case, solving a very serious problem. So that's on the problem side, and on the return side, you had tangible returns that could be realized, a unique way of investing with the investors being able to get their money back, hopefully, and roll it into the next project. So it made a lot of sense from New Profit's standpoint. We're glad to be part of that project.
So are we.
Obviously, also the James Irvine Foundation, as the leading California-only philanthropy, is looking at the area. Don, we think there's 15 or 20 projects brewing in the state of California right now, and we're looking at what role that the foundation can play there in helping. There's a lot of friction, as we know, in this marketplace. A lot of friction, red tape, money, training, dissemination of knowledge, and we think that organizations like the Irvine Foundation can potentially help eliminate some of that friction. So I'm interested as a board member. I'm interested as an investor. My family is an investor in a lot of socially based or projects with social impact, ranging from projects like Beartooth Capital, New Cycle Capital, that are doing investing in for-profit enterprises, and also in nonprofit social impact enterprises. And thirdly, I'm interested as a citizen in the area. And Kimberly mentioned the increasing polarity in this country, a concentration of wealth, unprecedented, really. And where is that wealth going to go? If it's not going to tax itself, a very difficult time taxing itself and getting it into the hands of the government to solve serious problems, potentially this is a new vehicle for individuals that otherwise have not participated in philanthropy and helping solve social problems to be connected. We all know in Silicon Valley that our level of philanthropy here is much lower on a per capita basis or per income or per wealth basis than the rest of the country, substantially below. And one of the really interesting things for me here is this is a potential to unlock a new breed of philanthropists that may not be attracted to the old style of philanthropy, but because this is data-driven, returns-driven, and ability to leverage your philanthropy through bank leverage or through being able to get your money back and recycle it, it may attract a new level of philanthropists that may not have had the chance or the interest in investing in these type of projects in the past. But as a venture capitalist, I'm trained to be a skeptic, but also, so a few things I'm skeptical about. Here, there was one board member at Irvine who was skeptical from a political philosophy standpoint, saying, geez, this is just another example of a market-based solution to a problem. And the landscape is littered with market-based solutions that don't always work. So that's kind of a philosophical objection that I've heard. There's the practical ones that we've talked about, the measurement, the ability to measure. And then the last obstacle, I think this is a really important one, is this whole idea of risk. I read in some of the literature that we really want to make these first projects successful, so we build confidence in the projects going forward. You can't carry that to an extreme, because if we don't have failure, we're not taking enough risk. So we're going to have failure along the way. We're going to have to deal with it. And in venture capital, we say you're not a venture capitalist until your first 2 investments have failed. And here we're going to have to find a way to make sure that we just don't get scared away when we have the inevitable failure. We can't have a Solyndra. I mean, there are Solyndras, right? There's failures, but that was, if you really looked in the scheme of things, a very small failure in the scheme of things. We have to learn to be tolerate failure. And I guess just finally, I guess what I would say, what is the role of philanthropy besides investing in these projects? I think there's a stage of development of a field that you need capital that is willing to have returns accrue to more than just the individual or organization that provides that capital. For instance, the internet. The internet was funded and developed mostly by the government through DARPA and other agencies. And you could not get a private investor or a private group to invest in the internet at the beginning, right? Because it was too large and returns accrued to others than the original investors. Philanthropists are going to have to be willing to make investments at the beginning that you may not achieve the returns that you might require, but you're doing benefit for the field as a whole. And then in addition, hopefully following up with investments in projects that make both investment sense and social impact sense. So thanks again, George, for having me here.
It's great for someone who's been at this such a short period of time, you claim. Those are tremendously insightful comments. Why don't we do this? Ian had a list of concerns. You just listed some concerns. I, too, have some venture capital in my background, and I know you always do better if you worry a lot. Let's hear your worries.
Okay, and I'm sorry that I jumped the gun.
Not
earlier.
at all.
You can't keep me down. I'm just so excited about this, honestly. As you can probably tell, I've kind of drank the Kool-Aid on Pay for Success. But it's not a panacea. There are some significant issues associated with it, and some of them have come up already, and I'll just get through them quickly. The data piece is going to be really important. Until we get our data house in order, none of this is going to work. And I don't just mean we need to collect better data. We need to agree at the outset who is going to be collecting that data, how it's going to be analyzed, how it's going to be presented, and commit at the beginning to abiding by the results. And if there's any lack of clarity on any of those points, can you imagine the litigation? I mean, if you're talking about a $30 million investment and there's some question about whether or not the data was collected in an appropriate way and analyzed in an appropriate way. So we need to get the data piece fixed. The political optics are challenging. Something that Caroline mentioned in her, she had that slide with all of the risks, and one of them was the headline risk. She was talking about negative headlines. There's actually headline risk associated with success. So for example, if the Utah SIB deal works, and the purpose of that SIB deal is to reduce the number of kids in special education, what does that headline look like? State cuts funds for special education, because that's where the savings are going to come from. So there's actually headline risks associated with success as well. So the political optics are complicated. I think we should be very careful about tying payments and savings together too directly. There's this instinct to track every dollar of savings and then take it and use it to pay back the investor. That's going to be very hard to do practically for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. So I think to the extent that savings can be one of the factors that goes into determining what the payment should be, that's an appropriate role for savings, but it shouldn't be the end-all be-all for determining what the payment rate should be for success. Government capacity and appropriations risk, present company excluded. There's going to be a lot of governments out there that don't have the capacity to do this. We're talking about retraining staff. We're talking about rethinking how we do social procurement, social policy procurement. That's going to be very complicated. Appropriations risk, we could spend all day talking about. Is the government actually going to pay out if you succeed? If you're talking about a different legislature, a different governor, a different board of supervisors, how much confidence do you have that the government is going to follow through? Big issue. And then finally, the one that I think is worth ending on is there are ethical considerations here. If we're talking about a market-based solution, we're talking about, to some extent, outsourcing social policy to private actors. There are ethical considerations. For example, if your success is reducing the number of the frail and elderly who go to the emergency room with preventable conditions, and your solution to that is to chain them to their beds to keep them from going to the hospital, obviously we've gone astray. So we need to build in protections into these contracts that ensure that service providers don't exceed their authority and do things that are clearly inappropriate and would potentially adversely affect these vulnerable populations. So ethical considerations also.
I'm having a little post-traumatic stress syndrome because you're describing, we deal with these issues all the day. Just to take the last one, there are different models available for pay for success. One of them is what might be called the privatization model. That approach is you knock on the door of government and you say, too many kids going to prison, we'll handle that. Will you share some of your savings? Just write us a check, but don't ask us how we do it. And that's an interesting approach. It's also a non-starter for government, it turns out, in many cases. And so in Massachusetts, the ROCA project is a public-private partnership model where the decision rights, the programmatic decision rights, the rights of do you or don't you chain someone to their bed, for example, very much includes government officials. They are extremely tuned in, and appropriately so, tuned into headline risk. We also have something we call the double headline problem, which is interesting and vexing, which is it's quite possible that we could have a project that simultaneously achieves the best impact anyone has ever seen in a randomized controlled trial in terms of reducing recidivism, and simultaneously does not pencil out economically. So for example, if we have a 10% reduction, that actually in the social sciences is a tremendous reduction. But that doesn't mean that we've saved enough money for government to actually be able to pay for that whole program. So you can imagine opening up the newspaper, there on the front page says, best ever, big failure, all at the same time. And so we're grappling with all sorts of issues. Why don't how much time do we have left in this? About 15 minutes. Great. I figure we could keep talking, but maybe better would be if we could just open up the discussion in the room. Any thoughts on people's minds? Gravitating towards the risk side might be very useful.
There's a microphone here, so if you have
There's a microphone to be passed around.
While your questions, I want to, one thing I neglected to mention on the offset of the risk one of the real exciting parts, at least from the foundation standpoint and from my standpoint, is there are fantastic entrepreneurs in government and nonprofits that are either unknown or unable to access resources and have been unable, therefore, to accomplish all their potential. And that's one of the most exciting things about this, is that we're gonna find the Garys and find the Mollys and back them and provide them with the resources that they can do things that people didn't think was possible in the nonprofit or government world that you see done in the for-profit world.
Yeah. And while people are thinking of questions, I can't help hearkening back to something Kimberly said. It's the data, damn it. And I do want to tell the story. This is the story of Capital One, by the way, but it was 15 years ago that the credit card industry got its act together enough data-wise for a group to come with a starkly different strategy, which was the Moneyball strategy. And that indeed is what we applied at Capital One with success. 15 years later, we are having certain databases come online in government that are transformatively different. And let me just tell one story which kind of blew me away. Who here has heard of Raj Chetty? Is that a name? Here's someone. He would, because he's an academic. Raj Chetty just won a MacArthur Award. He's an economist at Harvard. And there was a newspaper article about some work he'd done in education, so I went in and said, I'd like to meet you, Raj. Are you willing to spend 15, 20 minutes with me? And I went to his office. I said, tell me the story of what you did. He said, well, I was able to pull together a database of 2 million students, grade school students, and I had 3 years worth of all their test scores pre and post in the year on standardized tests, as well as who their teachers were, what classrooms they were in, and so forth. I said, 2 million, that's a lot. He said, yeah, that's a lot. And he said, I was able to determine which teachers routinely were able to accelerate the learning of their kids by subtracting the pre-test from the post-test in each year. And I found that certain teachers were actually remarkably more capable than others at doing this. But I was also a little nervous that maybe it had to do with the environment. Maybe they were special friends with the principal or something. So I found the thousands of teachers who went away because of pregnancy, or who switched schools, or had some other thing which you could argue don't have a lot to do with your ability to teach. And I found that when they went away, the scores went down, and when they came back, the scores went up. When they switched schools, the old school, the scores went down, the new school, they went up. And I said, that is fascinating. But then he told me the thing that was really fascinating. He said, by the way, the data is 15 years old, and I have this other little database. It's called the tax returns of every American citizen. And I was able to get over an 80% match rate between each of these 2 million kids and the database of how much money they make now. And I was able to show that the top teachers routinely would bring about $200,000 more of earnings among the kids in their classroom. And I can prove it every data point. It goes, so there are 2,000 observations behind every data point on this graph. So I sit there and I say, oh my God, this is Moneyball. This really is Moneyball. And it's right here now. The final part of the discussion was, so it's also the Manhattan Project, isn't it? This is ridiculous. How much did this cost? He said, yeah, it did cost some money. It was $150,000. I said, what do you mean? He said, the data was already there. I just had to write code. And he said, I did have some friends in high places who helped me with data sharing agreements, because that was the hard part. The hard part was dealing with the protection. And thank you, Greta. Please stand up and take a bow. Most important person in the room is right over there. In many cases, the data does exist, and this is a question of dealing with the privacy issues, for example, and also good discernment about what are the clean databases versus what are the ones that aren't ready to go. All right, by now people have questions that they're ready to ask. Yes?
There's a lot more, there's several projects that are percolating. Could this be a statewide or a larger initiative than a local initiative? And I say that because the governor is very interested in poverty. He's taken a couple of actions lately toward that end, and I do know there's some interest in the legislature this year of focusing on poverty. Is this transferable into a bigger statewide effort?
So I'll just take a quick stab at that. To your low-income housing tax credit question, I think for those of you who work with the credit, if you put a LIHTC structure up against a SIB structure, you'll notice that they actually look very similar. The only difference in my mind between LIHTC and a SIB is that instead of a payout at the end, there's a penalty if you don't achieve success. But the rest is all there. You have private investors who come in at the front end who pay for the development. You have a performance-based contract, which is the affordability of that project for 15 consecutive years. And then you have a government payer. And in this case, it's with tax credits, but with SIBs, it would be an appropriation. So I see them as very similar. In terms of your question about can this happen at the state level, I think the state can play an enabling role. But one of the challenges that we have with any of these projects, and I'm certainly not an expert on this, there's a lot more experts in the room, is that you need to be able to draw some kind of straight line between the intervention and the result. And so there's a scale issue. So if you get to too big of a scale and you have no clear sense of who is ultimately responsible for success or failure, it's very difficult to build a performance-based contract around that. So I think that local scale is actually better for most pay-for-success contracts. But again, the state and the federal government can play an enabling role in supporting that local activity.
Yeah. And we've been working around the country on this topic as well. There are several states that are initiating pay-for-success policy. And there's a subset of interventions which are scalable enough to move the needle at a state level, or at least in a catchment area within a state, and that lend themselves to evaluation. At the end of the day, what you really need is the ability to evaluate the impact in a way that satisfies everyone that it's truth. And you need a level of scale that produces cost benefit. These transactions are not inexpensive to put together in the first place. But in South Carolina, we'll see a home nurse visitation project, very likely. In New York State, we're now at the finalist stage of selecting interventions there. My guess is that we'll see a deflection in the juvenile justice area, perhaps as a New York State project. We'll see. But their work, it's fascinating because we are finding that we can move more quickly at the county level, and which is great, and ultimately that's going to be important. At the state level, it's elephant hunting, but that's also happening too. Yes.
If these programs work, why don't governments just do them?
You got one of the toughest questions. So I had the three hardest questions. So may I attempt to answer this, or does someone else want to?
Well, certainly one of them. I'll ask one, certainly is the timing and funding. Governments in general are short on funding. Take the ROCA project, for example. ROCA is not going to get paid until it delivers results. In the meantime, it needs to operate. We're going to spend roughly $20 million or so during that time.
Yeah.
A little more than that? About roughly that.
Yeah,
So,
roughly that, yeah.
So their outside investors provide that financing the government would not have access to nor be willing to pay. So that's one answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one is the will is strong, but the body is weak.
Yeah.
You need the money. There's a second one that's tied to innovation. We have a history in America of what I might call a fund what once worked concept. Comma, maybe. Ian said 3% have been subjected to evaluations. Among the 10% of federal social spending streams, which collectively are many hundreds of billions of dollars a year, 1/10 have been subjected to rigorous trials. And five large pieces of that have been subjected, and only 1 out of 10 of the large-scale trials has revealed a discernible difference between those who were treated versus those who were not treated. So what it would say is that $9 out of 10 are spent on programs where you cannot, when you look at things you care about and the life course, the statistics that reflect the life course of those who are in the group versus not in the group randomly, you cannot discern a difference. And to me, that means there's a huge opportunity to reallocate dollars. Now, you could say, well, then therefore, if you find something that works, why don't you just pull the policy lever and say, Eureka, let's do it, let's roll it out. And the problem is that's what we have been doing. And we end up, we say, that works. Let's write it up like a recipe, and there ought to be a law. And everyone for the next 30 years who says they follow the recipe is reimbursed. Now, the problem is that these recipes don't work universally, and the world changes very quickly. So we have a way of doing policy where we don't have this continuous feedback loop that allows us to follow the changes and therefore invite innovation over time. That would be the answer. And most people will buy that eventually. But I still do worry that many politicians will say, well, that's very nice, but I'm going to roll this thing out because people love it. Yeah. Greta.
So I had a quick question related to that, which is in the healthcare arena, at least, there's a lot of obstacles to using a pay-for-success type mechanism built into state law, for example, where under Medi-Cal you have to pay on a fee-for-service basis. What experiences do you have, or is there energy in the works to try and liberate some of these funding mechanisms that are highly regulated in a way that stands as an obstacle to using this type of a procurement method?
You want to go for that one?
I think the ACA has created a lot of opportunities and models that we can build on. Accountable care organizations being one of them. For those of you who aren't familiar with ACOs, it's an attempt to reduce the medical care of Medicare eligible patients by creating a network of providers that roughly sort of operates as an HMO. And to the extent that they can keep their population of patients who they serve they can keep their medical use down. The federal government through CMMI will pay for that outcome, that success, sort of a reward for having reduced the need for that care and the costs that would have accrued to the federal government. So that's one example of how I think we can accomplish exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely the case that there are very substantial spending streams which, because of the laws that are behind them, do not permit a future obligation based on something that may or may not happen. So this multi-year contingent commitment problem is a difficult one for many, many spending streams. But government also has a lot of other nooks and crannies and pools of money that can be used for purposes of innovation that are more flexible. And I think we are going to go through a phase now where the piloting is done using these more flexible dollars. But in order for this to scale, we are going to have legislative change. An example of legislative change in Massachusetts, which is dramatic, is that we were able to get a 2/3 vote through the legislation that attached the full faith and credit to the obligations made for our $50 million worth of pay-for-success funding in that state. And what that means is if they fail, well, it means two things. One is they can make a multi-year commitment, which is a nice trick. The second thing is if the administration changes and the new governor doesn't like this thing, it'll still be paid. And that's because if they do not honor the moral obligation of this full faith and credit obligation, the credit rating of the state is called into question. So some states are able to do that. Others, they would have to actually change the Constitution to be able to do that. And so we're all learning together. Yes?
Well, I think this is somewhat related, but perhaps a slight step forward, which is just to relate a conversation that I recently had with some high-level folks at the Treasury Department who were in charge of the federal government's Pay-for-Success program that they're trying to kind of push through. And I was talking with them about some of the transactions that we have underway and, presenting some opportunities for them to be helpful. I don't get a great sense that, the president's budget and that request is moving forward with rocket speed. But one thing that they did say, which really influenced my thinking, was don't bring me ideas around Medicaid. Bring me ideas around Medicare. Because Medicare is a bipartisan, we've got to solve, we need solutions issues, and would not necessarily be the first population that we would be on the highest priority list for the foundation. But I think it's an interesting way to think about that we have to make these issues important to both sides of the aisle in order to access the federal funds that will be necessary to make this really go to scale. And so trying to think about the things that are important to that constituency, even if it means that it's a little bit further upstream, and then the ideas kind of need to trickle downstream to more vulnerable populations.
It's a great point.
Hi, I just had a question going back to the data, and I wanted to challenge George a little bit on that's the $150,000 to put that data set together, and really, talk about the investment in the actual data systems that that came from, and what you expect like a real investment would be, because we've talked about data and the need for the investment in that. And what should folks be expecting to invest in that to gather the information, to get those systems together to properly do this?
Yeah. Data sets are like beautiful shells that come up on the shore occasionally. And most of those shells are way out there, and it would be very expensive to find them. But there are places in government where through hundreds of millions of dollars and decades of hard work, they're finally ready to go. And the reason it only cost them $150,000 isn't that it was inexpensive to build the data sets. It's that they have been built and they're now ready to be used. And so one thing we are seeing in government, we see over and over again, I don't think it's overstating it to say there's a quiet revolution taking place of administrative data. And what we mean is that government in running government used to be paper-based, used to have lots of separate data systems, operational systems, but there are now more cloud-based systems and more standard systems that multiple governments use. Let me give one example. In the foster care industry, there exists now a nonprofit organization that is in the business of compiling the data across all foster care systems. And they have data sharing agreements that are covering about 90% of the counties in California. And they get a download 3 times a day of every transaction having to do with every young person in the foster care system. They have 15 social scientists in Wisconsin, is it? I think it's in Wisconsin, but out in the Midwest, whose job it is to analyze that data every day. And they're covering a large portion of everything that's happening in California. They are also in several other states, all centralized in a single database system, just ready to be the backbone of this pay-for-success contracting. There are other places where it'll take hundreds of millions of dollars to begin to do it, and I'm afraid we're going to need to be patient for those.
If I can follow up, I don't have a specific answer how much it costs. It's going to vary. But the corollary to your question, why doesn't the states do it, or why doesn't the government do it? And the question we always ask when we're looking at investment, if this is such a great idea, why wasn't it done before? Yeah. And there's lots of answers, a confluence of things. But one is that computing power is almost free, storage is almost free. The tools are so much better than they were even 5 years ago. So that has enabled the cost to come down, and the effectiveness of data acquisition, manipulation, and interpretation. And, we're seeing it in the venture world. It costs a lot less to start a company now than it did 10 years ago because of these tools.
Yeah. Maybe one more question over there, and then we'll wrap up. Yes.
So the savings to government are incremental savings, and the cost to the service providers, especially new ones, are full cost base. Plus, you're throwing an element of a return for the investor into the SIBs. How does that all pencil out?
Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it does, I guess is the first answer. There's no reason why they should actually be the same. It's just you can imagine in medicine, there's some pills that are very inexpensive that keep you from getting the plague. No one gets plague anymore. And if we got plague, it would be hugely expensive to take care of. So it isn't necessarily true that the cost of administering a prevention is going to be the same size as the benefit. In government, we are finding also that, as Gary pointed out, there are areas of social policy where you might not see a cash-on-cash cost benefit, but where it's nevertheless good policy to have performance-based contracting. Sorry to hog that
No,
answer. I didn't
that's
even
perfect.
think of looking the other way. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, George. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's really nice to join you.